Hey everybody, it's Dr. Vibe, the host of the Good Men Project's monthly Google Hangouts for premium members, and hope everyone's checking this out live. It is going to be another great conversation provided by the Good Men Project, and tonight we have a very special guest, Dr. Steve Perry, and he is the principal of Capital Preparatory Magnet School. He has his Master's of Social Work, and he's an education contributor for CNN and MBC, an Essence magazine columnist, best-selling author, and the host of the #1 docudrama on the television station TVONE, Save My Son. Dr. Perry believes that the success of a life is determined by where you end, not where you start. It is this philosophy that inspired him to transform the lives of poor and minority children by providing them with the access to college education. We are very happy to have him here tonight and discussing boys and education, especially how men can help boys be successful in the area of education. We're also joined by one of the GMP premium members, Mark Sherman, who's been on a Google Hangout with me before. So first things, we like to welcome Dr. Perry. How are you, sir?
I'm well, thank you. And you?
I'm doing fine. I'm going to call you Steve in a T-shirt because you told me Steve in a T-shirt to refer
right.
you.
Repping Capital Prep, my school.
All right. Your Capital Prep Steve tonight. And Mark, thank you also for making time to share with us tonight.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Pleasure. Dr. Perry, let me just first ask just the opening conversation piece. What is the state of boys and education in the United States at this present time, in your opinion?
It's bleak. There's an achievement gap between girls and boys. The boys are the most likely to be suspended, punished, or even expelled. There are a number of boys are more likely than girls to be identified as having special needs. I believe that there's an over-feminization of primary education where boys are essentially being punished for being boys.
All right. What do you mean by an over-feminization in the education system? Can you provide some examples for us?
Sure. When we look at some of the simplest things that boys do, if you told a couple of little boys to go out and play, what would they do? They go fight. That's what they do. And if they had their little sister with them, she should get ready to fight too, because that's what boys do. It's the way that they play. And when they act as boys typically do, they're often treated as if somehow their natural instincts are a malady. You often hear conversations about boys being able to sit still. And that's why they're so often prescribed medication around the issue of ADD or ADHD or some other some other malady having to do with attention span. But we see that boys typically learn differently. And there's no emphasis on the difference. The place where the difference comes into play, it somehow becomes a limitation. And that's a problem. Therein lies the over-feminization. So the emphasis is on making boys act like girls typically act.
Okay. Mark, do you want to add any opening comments that you want to add to what's...
Virtually totally agree with what Steve said. I mean, it's like what can I say? I feel so much the same way. I have not been an educator the same way. I was a college professor for many years. I retired, but I've been interested in gender issues for a long, long time. And I'm old enough to remember when there was all this interest, there still is, in things like Take Our Daughters to Work Day. There was a book in 1993 or 4 called Failing at Fairness, How America's Schools Cheat Girls, and already boys weren't doing as well as girls. Even then, that was 1993. This is now more than 20 years later. The situation has only gotten worse. I have 3 grown sons. I have 4 young grandsons who range in age from 7 months old to 8 years old. And I see pretty much what he is saying. It's almost like there's something wrong with being a boy in so many places, and I think it's done our sons and our grandsons a huge disservice. So I always feel good when I hear someone saying these things, which the country as a whole I don't think has yet come to recognize.
Some people get upset, Mark, because I use the term over-feminization because they think that somehow that is saying something bad about the women who are teaching in the schools. These are just facts. The facts are that our boys are simply being mistreated by the school system. They just are. They're being treated as if there's something wrong with them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Dr. Perry, let me interject then. How long has this existed in your opinion? Did it exist when you were going to school?
Well, it's hard for me to tell what was happening when I was in school, though I was in trouble a lot. I don't know if it was earned, my trouble,
right.
my assessments. But I can say this from a data perspective, as Professor has said earlier, that this has been going on since really the mid to late 60s. This is when the trend started to take shape, where you started to see boys getting in more and more trouble. And then through the 70s, it became more of an issue. And now it's a full-blown problem. The tide has turned significantly, and it is a bad thing to be a boy in today's schools.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
So what have been some of the root causes, in your opinion, then, Dr. Perry, for this situation to be so prevalent in today's society, at least American society?
Well, I think the way that first of all, most of the people who are teaching in primary school, where most of the assessments are done of young people, are women. And it doesn't make a woman unprofessional because she comes from a perspective that has something to do with her own gender experiences. It simply means that each one of us, you as a black man, I as a black man, and anyone else, we have experiences. Doesn't mean we can't be professional, but it does mean it has some impact on the way we see the world. And you have entire entire schools in which there are virtually no men in positions of authority to assess what's going on. I was in a PPT today, and I was the only male in the conversation, and there were 11 of us in the room, including the mother, and we were talking about a boy, and much of what we were talking about could have easily been written off as he's 8, and that's what 8-year-old boys do. He was, one of the things that they were saying is that sometimes he just lays out on the floor, and that's bad. And I mean, I guess it's bad if he was told not to, but if left to his own devices, laying on the floor is not a ridiculous notion.
Yep.
This seems like it's actually become like a battle in the school system to get boys the recognition, maybe some of the rights that they deserve. Am I saying something out of course there, in your opinion, Dr. Perry?
No, not at all. The boys, unfortunately, if these numbers were reversed and this were girls who were having this level of difficulty in school, there would be laws against it.
Mm-hmm.
You really think so?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, I completely
go ahead, Mark.
I'm sorry. I completely agree. And in fact, what I've seen, and again, I've been interested in these issues for a long, long time. And for example, here's an example of this kind of thing. This is not just school stuff. This is often slightly older kids, but they're still youth. The suicide rate for young males is way, way higher than it is for young females. And I agree completely with Dr. Perry that if that rate for girls was what it has been and continues to be for boys, it would be front page news. In fact, there was a news story a while back. I wrote a letter to the New York Times. I wrote a letter and that never got published because the suicide rate for girls had increased. And that's depressing. And a suicide for any young person is horrible. But it increased, and yet, even with an increase, it was still way, way below what it was for boys. And so it's that kind of thing. If it's a boy's problem, it just doesn't, like eating disorders, boys have the eating disorders too. But I guess it's more girls. Well, that got tremendous amounts of attention, and boys are barely even mentioned. And I do think that when a problem is more found among girls, and look, girls are great and women are great, but boys and men are great too, and they should not ever be looked upon in a secondary kind of way.
Dr. Perry, then, why has the education system not given this more attention, provided more solutions, not provided more resources, in your opinion, to this issue?
Because I think, honestly, there are people who who work in the schools who don't see it as a problem.
Mhm.
It's often, I often find myself in conversations with many educators. See, one of the problems is, in our country, excuse me, we're so label driven. Either you're a conservative or you're a liberal. You're a Republican or a Democrat. And whichever side you're on, you have to own their whole ideology. So if you're a Cowboys fan, you just have to be a Cowboys fan, and you can't give any credit to any other team. And that works when you're 8 years old or 10 years old and you're picking teams, but it doesn't work when you're putting together very important policies around children. And the problem is that so many educators are frightened with being called names like sexist and racist.
Mm-hmm.
So many of them are so frightened about the labels, but in their fear, they're essentially capitulating to the very issues that they sought to undo. So if sexism is meaning that one gender receives certain privileges that the other doesn't, then sexism is still very real. It's just now in our schools, the sexism is hurting boys. And we're just unwilling to have these conversations. You would be surprised at how many people, if they heard Professor Sherman and I having this conversation, would riot. They would just, it would be, they'd call us every kind of horrible name in the book. And I'll give you a very specific, for instance. I said that there was an over-feminization of primary education, and an assistant superintendent, who was my boss at the time, said to me, I have a real problem with what you just said. He said, I have a real problem with what you just said.
Wow.
And I said,
wow.
I said, well, if you're telling me I can't say it because you're going to fire me, then you should fire me because it's true. He said, well, why would you say that? I said, well, who were the most suspended children in a school? He said, black boys.
Mm-hmm.
I said, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then who are the most disciplined children in the school? He said, boys, and mostly boys of color. I said, okay. And then who? He said, girls of color. I said, and then who? He said, white girls. I said, well, who's teaching in the schools? I mean,
Wow.
you can't. We can do the sensitivity training and we can have the conversations, but there has to be some fundamental shifts as to what is a malady. For instance, why do we tell children to sit on a carpet? I mean, we're three men. How comfortable would each one of us be sitting on a carpet?
Very.
We'd have to rock. We'd have to get momentum to get up. Once we get down there, we'd have to roll on our side and then roll back just to get up.
God.
True.
And so you ask yourself the question, why would you put a classroom full of boys on a carpet?
Mm-hmm.
What in life, whenever in life, are they going to sit on a carpet?
Mm-hmm.
It serves no function. Yet and still, even at my school, we have carpets. Our teachers fought and wanted to have carpets, and they have little painted squares on them where each kid is supposed to sit in their color square. We have desks behind them. They could sit in the desk.
Yep.
Wow. How much of a role, we're talking about the education system, but what about the home?
Mm.
Is there, in your opinion, because I know you have children, what are you seeing? What are you hearing from parents in the home? Are you seeing this over-feminization of the young people in a family also?
Absolutely. We have, I mean, our families have been obliterated. And especially among minorities and poor, women are carrying the whole entire weight. These women were raised to be strong women. And as such, they're going to make the decision. And they have to. They're the only person in the house, so they have to make the judgment call. And very often, this is the way the conversation goes. A female teacher and her female principal call the mom, and they talk about the boy. And all three of them can't understand why this boy is insane.
Right.
And they all describe very boy-based behaviors. And they all agree that there's something clearly wrong with him because none of them ever remember doing anything like that.
Mark, do you want to contribute at all?
I'm finding Dr. Perry is just what he's saying is very inspiring to me. As I said, my sons are all grown. My grandsons aren't. And what he says makes such sense. Now, I will say on the positive side, there are some people, not enough of them, who are working to try to, there's a book by someone named Kelly King about, I forget the exact title, but it's about the boy-friendly classroom. I mean, there are some people who look at classrooms and they say this is not working for boys, and they make suggestions as to how classrooms could be improved. But I still think they are not as widely known as people who keep the same things going that aren't so boy-friendly at all. I will say this, by the way, my whole hope someday, I will say clearly that part of my motivation comes from my family. The fact that I do have 3 sons, the fact that I have 4 grandsons, never had a daughter, never had a granddaughter, would like one someday. The granddaughter, the kids are, that's it for us with kids. But the fact is, I really hope that the parents of sons, as for advocacy, will really start to recognize that their children are not getting the attention and the schooling and the treatment that they deserve. And I think most parents, they just love their children. And to realize that your kids, if they're males, are simply not getting that attention, I think, I'm just hoping that consciousness sometime is there.
Dr. Perry,
I'll tell you this.
Go ahead.
One of the things, you know, as Professor Sherman is just talking about, I went into, my sons go to my school, and I went into class today. My 8-year-old, I went into his class today, and his teacher understands some of the challenges. She has a number of boys. She actually has probably about a 60-40, maybe even 70-30 boy-girl classroom. She was struggling at the beginning because you know they're 8 and they're on fire. And and one of the things that I saw her do today, this is a true story. She has these dance breaks. True story. They turn on the smart board and they put on Kids Bop. And when I was in there, there were 8 little boys dancing to Beyonce's "Put a Ring on It."
Okay.
And they were fired up, and they were having a ball, and they were letting off the steam, and she lets them earn the dance privileges. And it sounds like a simple thing, but even Sesame Street, when they were forming it, made it very clear that they understood that there were attention span challenges, and that's why they put Sesame Street the way they did, and then they threw music in between there. Right. It worked for a generation, and then we forgot that somewhere along the pedagogical conversation. In addition to that, as Professor Sherman has said, it's not just about education, it's also about the treatment that they're not receiving. Because untreated boys tend to become our prisoners.
Wow, that's strong. Strong.
Many a young man has gotten his first conversation with a psychiatrist because he was about to get locked up. And when you know that there's nothing wrong with you, but you feel like people keep treating you like something's wrong with you, you tend to act out. And along the lines of suicide, there's a reason, there are a number of theories as to why their suicide is higher among boys than it is among girls, but it tends to be that males, when angry or hurt, lash out, whereas females, when angry or hurt themselves. And so there's a number of methods that women use to hurt themselves, including having sex with people they don't want to have sex with. It's just a form of self-mutilation. Well, similarly, with boys, they act out. And they become aggressive because that aggression somehow seems in their minds to provide them with some sense of solace and to alleviate the pain. It's why you'll never hear well, I won't say never, but you'll hear a boy buy a punching bag because he wants to let off steam.
Right.
As opposed to what a woman may do typically, which is to go talk to a friend. And so our males are not receiving the level of treatment that they receive at earlier ages. And they're being treated for being male as opposed to whatever real issues are there. You can't talk a boy out of being a boy, no matter how many times you punish him for being a boy.
That's good stuff.
You know, I agree.
Mark, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that, you know, there's a lot of stuff, and I'm fine with this. There's a lot of concern about boys who, let's say, aren't traditional boys, who just, you know, don't act in the way that so many boys do, and that we should welcome them and not bully them. I'm totally in agreement. But what's sometimes lost in that is boys who do act whatever traditional boyish behavior is, they should be welcomed as well. And that, I think, is really important. In other words, yes, let's be open-minded about boys who don't fit the usual boy mold, whatever that may be. But let's not somehow treat the boys who are we've always, boys often seem to be, let's not treat them as if there's something wrong with them for doing that, and that's what gets me. It's as if there's this expression, boys will be boys. I can understand that if boys are being too violent stuff, no, we don't want that. But that expression, a lot of people don't want to ever hear that, like boys will be boys, as if, again, what Dr. Perry has been saying, there's something wrong with just being a boy, that you're kind of, by default, not so great, and you better be somehow shaped up so you can be better, because being a boy, immediately, there's something wrong with you. Really, that's seems extreme, but I see it that way.
But let me take it one step further. It's one of the reasons why the military has been so successful at working with young men, because many of these young men couldn't get the discipline and respect and the very adrenaline, testosterone-driven experience that they wanted. And so in their academic life, they found very little success. But you put them in a platoon with other men and watch as they come home after just 6 weeks. As somebody who works in the pre-K to 12 arena, there are times that we've sent young men. I can think of one young man in particular. He was heavy. He had long hair. School was never his thing. But he was bright. We all knew he was bright. It just seemed like he wanted to hide it from the rest of us. So James decided he was going to go to the Marines. We thought, oh, God, why? This is the most, anti-everything human being that you're ever going to meet. He freaking loves he loves the discipline, the tradition, the strength. He loves it. It means everything to him, because it's the same reason why many traditional boys find themselves being successful on a team. There's something about it. You can see one coach, one volunteer coach, take 40 kids who don't know each other, put them in the hot sun, put helmets and shoulder pads on them, and get them to stand still for hours on end, or even worse, run into each other, and then do it over and over again.
Right.
And still, they will respond, because we're responding to the part of them that is, in fact, still traditionally male. And the problem that we face so often, sadly, is that the beauty of being a traditional boy is lost because we're trying to respond to a minority group who are not necessarily traditional boys, as beautiful as they are. And the pendulum so often swings from one extreme to the other that we lose reason.
Yeah, I think he's right. I agree. And I also think, I just want to say very quickly, I think part of boys' energy, there's a certain creativity a lot of boys have. Sometimes they don't fit into the regular school system situations well, because they're very creative. Their minds are just going in certain ways. And it used to be that was okay. I mean, the drawings that boys used to do, or the stories they would write, sometimes they had some violent stuff in them. These were stories and drawings. These were not, they weren't planning to do anything violent. From what I hear, there's this zero tolerance thing for that.
Yeah, you'll get suspended for that now.
Yeah, and I mean, and this is sometimes the creative way that boys' minds work, and it doesn't mean they're going to hurt anybody.
They can't draw guns.
Yeah, it's.
So if a boy came, this is truth. If a boy came in with a picture that he had drawn of 2 kids killing each other, blood spurting all over the place,
right.
His mother would be called. We'd sit him down and tell him, "Don't you ever do that again." And he's looking at you like, "What did I do wrong?" And then they say that, and he's like, "But what? What did I do?"
Right.
And then at some point, he just capitulates. He just says, "Okay, fine. If it means me not getting in trouble again, I'm going to try and figure out what these folks are saying, that I'm doing this so bad or wrong."
Right.
Let me ask you, Dr. Perry, what role do men need to play in the role of boys and being successful in education? Because you mentioned earlier on during our conversation that most of the decisions are being made by women and the men aren't around. What do you feel men need to do in order to turn this around?
I actually would like to see more men in primary education. I think a lot goes right and wrong in primary school. Primary school is acutely focused on the affective, so you'll hear teachers talk about your friend and your friend. Don't you like your friend and your friend? Not understanding that boys don't think always in those same terms. It's just they don't need that level of friendship of group. Boys don't typically travel in groups, whereas the part of the emphasis of the primary school education is that everyone's your friend. Whereas boys don't always think in those terms. Many of us can think we've had one friend. Like your entire life, you got one friend.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas girls can go from group of friends to, they literally can go from 5 friends over here, shuffle the deck, get 5 more friends over here, shuffle the deck, and work their way around. It's just a different way that we are socialized. And even if you look at we need a more prominent and willing to speak the truth man's voice in primary education. And we need more women who are sensitive to it, who are willing to take a look at the data and to ask themselves, why am I sending mostly boys out of class? Could it be me? You know, is there something wrong with all these boys? I mean, and we have to have this conversation in our school pretty regularly. We have to say, you know, have you looked at the numbers of kids that you're sending out of class? Are the girls always behaving themselves, really? They don't do anything that makes them get sent out of class? So maybe you should do something differently. So, and unless you have someone in the room who says, time out, folks, time out. This is not okay. You can't keep kicking boys out for being boys. Then we're going to keep running into the same situation. And I submit to you, I was in Memphis this weekend, and every day this past week someone was shot. Every person who shot someone was a boy, and everyone who was shot was a boy.
Wow.
And 2 people were murdered, and 1 kid, an African-American male, was shot sitting in his bedroom. If we don't get our arms around this, if we don't get our arms around it now, all the polite, politically correct crap is going to fall by the wayside, and we're going to find ourselves in a really tough situation. Every single day this week, someone was shot in Memphis. That's one town in a great big country with big old issues.
Wow. Mark, anything you want to add on that?
No, I've heard a lot of. I relate so much, and I just think I feel someday, you know, people, government people will start to really, you know, there's an initiative from the president about minority males. I think it's a step in the right direction. I just think this consciousness has to be raised. I mean, boys, and again, I'm hoping it comes to some degree from the parents, grandparents of boys who have these children they love, and so I just think I think Dr. Perry is doing great.
Well, I would say this, I want to make sure I make this final point, and that is that I don't want it to be said that I think that the female teachers are doing it on purpose.
No.
It's not that at all. They're just doing it differently. And we need to be mindful of that. It's the same way, you know, again, this is the politically correct thing. We don't want white people saying certain things about black people, and so we're all very, very conscious of that, and we, you know, sensitivity training through the eyes and yada, yada, yada. But you can basically tee off on any boy you want, say anything you want to him, and the tougher and rougher, the more traditional the boy is, the more you can say to him. I mean, the more you can mistreat this child, and it really is mistreatment, because we're forgetting some of these kids are 3 and 4 years old. Little babies. I mean, they don't know any better. They don't.
Right.
I went in our pre-K classroom a couple days last week, the week before last, and I watched the little girls. They played together. They sat down. They shared. Yada yada. The boys were like hunters gatherers. They reached down and take a block from somebody, and they'd run over to the next group. And it just, like, you've ever seen, you know, within the animal kingdom, you see that one male will go snatch something and run away, and the other one will chase them. And that's what they did, and they did that as many times as they could get away with it in the classroom. And some of them knew that they would get in trouble. These are 3-year-olds. Some of them knew they would get in trouble if they did it, so they would take it, and then they'd walk away, because they knew running was a problem. But they still took it.
Wow.
Wow.
Well, Dr. Perry, I know your time is really tight, and you know that you have time with your family time. We don't want to impose on that at all. We'd just like to thank you for taking the time to share with our audience tonight. Do you have any parting thoughts or parting things you'd like to say before we let you go?
Boys are people too.
Yeah, I love that.
There you go.
Thanks.
That's good stuff. Mark, any last words you'd like to say?
No, I thought that was a great way to end it. Boys are people too. I like that.
Excellent. Dr. Perry, if people want to connect with you, what is the best way they can do?
At Dr. Steve Perry on Twitter.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for everyone who was watching this live. We had a number of people viewing tonight. Check us out every month on the Good Men Project. We have different topics once a month, and for premium members, you can join the conversation live. This is Dr. Vibe at the Good Men Project, one of the most viewed sites for men in the world. We're getting at the Good Men Project 5.4 million unique page views a month, and 25 million page views a month. So thank you so much for everyone for watching and listening. Take care and see you next month.